This is going to be an advanced session talking about the type data API in Drupal 8. In the last year or so, I've explored this kind of once undocumented type data API, and I like to talk about it. I've given a few similar talks at MidCamp in Chicago this spring and in Drupal Camp, Ohio last year. If you don't know about me, my name is Matthew Radcliffe, or M. Radcliffe on Drupal.org. Nice to meet you. I work for a small company called Composite. We're based out of Columbus and Athens, Ohio. We publish a visual programming language called Xero. And basically what I'm going to do is kind of summarize my use cases for using type data API and why I wanted to use it when I first found out about it and what my end goal was. And that's going to go through some accounting stuff because that's the module I've written to use it, but it's applicable to a whole bunch of other things. And then we'll dig into some of the details such as the Drupal 8 plugin API and unit testing with PHP unit and how much of a mess that can be when you start digging into some of the more complicated services in Drupal 8. So what we're really talking about here is composite data types. And normally, if you think of a data type in programming language, it's something simple like an integer or string or a char, float. And composite data types are the more complex things. So a class in a good programming language, a class itself is a data type. Structs and whatnot. In Drupal, associative arrays are kind of like a composite data type in Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. They tell us about, we describe our data in gigantic associative arrays. And this is kind of what I was doing in Drupal 6. And then we get to like entity API. An entity, in my opinion, is a composite data type. Is everyone familiar with that term, data type, composite data type? Not really. So, but again, a class is a composite data type, and type data is kind of a meta around composite data types, right? We're coming up with our own way of describing data types in Drupal 8, and that's what type data is. They're strongly typed interfaces that can present the various subsystems in Drupal, such as serialization, and which ties into RESTful interfaces. And again, any class is really a data type. But for this session, think of when I say data type, it's specific to this type data API. So what are some of the use cases for type data? We describe data defined elsewhere. So a really good use case is thinking about external systems, education schemas such as LTI, media, ways of describing media or video from YouTube, the accounting API that is my use case. So all these kind of special snowflake data types that you might be integrating. I mean, how many people here have integrated with a third-party system in Drupal or any other system, right? A lot of us. I do it all the time. So the type data API is a way we want to describe this sort of thing. So my use case, and I'll be talking about this as kind of an example, is the Xero accounting platform. So Xero provides an accounting software as a service for small businesses. So our use case at Composite is I want to post invoices from open Atrium cases and then get back to coding because we're not a big company. Or I'm on a commerce site and I want to have someone makes a purchase. So in the background, it makes a bank transaction back to Xero with the payment information. So we can do bank reconciliation, which is a fancy way of balancing your books. And then if you didn't have this, you'd have to go manually creating all these bank transactions, and it takes a lot of time. So as a small business, we have a premium on time. So this is something that we really needed. So I did this in Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. And that's done through basically a lot of procedural code. And so in order to explain type data API and my uses of it, I kind of have to explain what I'm doing with it in Drupal 6. So basically Xero does OAuth signed requests using curl. It does some weak validation with a form validation, and then I model the data as giant associative arrays because we love associative arrays. And then I have an external library that I have to use to post that data. It kind of looks like this. It sucks. It is really bad. Let's move on. Let's not look at that any longer. So in in Drupal 8, it provides a lot of things. So back a couple of years ago, I was looking at Drupal 8. We had some Symfony code. We had Guzzle 3 at the time. It's now Guzzle 6. So I was looking at Guzzle, and Guzzle provided an OAuth thing out of the box. I was like, awesome. And then I started looking at I was getting off the island. I was looking at what other things I could include that weren't PHP 0 that I have to maintain, and I hate that code. So I found an extension to Guzzle called Xero Bundle. It was really cool. And then I ran into Composer. I was like, okay, how am I going to deal with Composer in Drupal? And really, as I started looking at this, I attended these sessions in Munich in 2012, and just started learning about all the cool web services stuff that Drupal 8's doing. And we're using Guzzle, we're using serialization. So all these things are built into Drupal in Drupal 8. And then I got into this, started delving into this rabbit hole of dependency management. And this got quite complex. So I had to start learning Composer and autoloaders and all that, and libraries, GitHub culture. But, let's take a deep breath. Let's not worry about Composer. Let's not worry about vendor libraries. Let's kind of focus on learning Drupal 8. So with Drupal 8, we have a lot of complex systems. Dependency injection. We're using dependency injection. Sorry, I'm going a little fast. I'm sorry. Sometimes I start to talk fast. I need to catch my breath here. Right. So I wanted to start leveraging what Drupal 8 provided, and there's a lot of cool subsystems. The plugin API, we have the field API, we have the entity API, and serialization module, which helps serializing things. And so I'm kind of ready to start using it, right? So how do I get there? My goal is to make HTTP requests integrate with external systems. So I need two things. I need a way of describing my data in a way that Drupal understands. And these are both primitive and, one thing. I need a way of describing my data in a way Drupal understands, in both primitive and composite data types. And so I started questioning. I found type data. It looked like what I wanted. I said, why type data? Is it a good fit for me? Again, type data API is really low level in Drupal 8. It pretty much drives all the things, all the data things. I can inject it into forms, into my route controllers, into normalizers. So it's pretty much a good fit. I mean, since it's very low level, it's going to work well with core and contrib modules that are in Drupal 8, such as serialization and rules. I found a little bit of code in rules where it uses type data. It's like one line. It's like, bam, you get type data support. So that's kind of why I thought it was a good fit. So then I started looking at what kind of data I'm using, right? So in Xero, I have a whole bunch of data types, like line items, and invoices and payments. And these are all kind of complex things. Line items can be in invoices, they can be in payments. I have relatively simple types, like kind of accounts, where it's just a sales account or a checking account or bank account. And so I have all these things and more. And I'm like, okay, so do I want to use entities? And that's a big question. The entity system at one point was highly tied into type data. Entities were type data, they were data types. They're no longer data types, they just kind of have a loose integration. So I was like, do I want to use entities? And I'm of the opinion that I don't want to store things more than once. It's already stored out in the accounting system. So type data, I was like, okay, I don't want to use entities. So is there something in Drupal that describes what I'm looking for that's not an entity, it's not using storage? And there is. And so there's two types of complex data types. There's entities, and then there's something called a map. And a map is pretty much the Drupal 8 equivalent of an associative array. So it's a class-based hierarchical data type. And so I'm like, okay, this is awesome. I think I can do it. So how do I go about actually creating this, data type? How do I go about describing my data types to Drupal? And before, in the other sessions that I've given about type data, these documentation pages either didn't exist or they weren't filled out at all. So starting, I think, in Los Angeles, I actually filled out the doc page a little bit with that, on type data. And on the API site, there's also a topic now on type data. And it's probably not as verbose, but it can be a good start. So the first thing we have to realize is describing a data type. So data types are plugins. Is anybody not familiar with what a plugin is in Drupal 8?
Question, is it like the CTools plugin API ported, or is it totally different from that?
Completely different. So in Drupal 8 comes with a component called a plugin. And plugins are pretty much all the things. Entities, blocks. So it's describing a whole bunch of different things. And a plugin is a way, uses what's called annotation for discovery. So if I have a plugin class, Drupal has this fancy way of going and finding a bunch of plugins via annotation. And so data type is one of those is one kind of plugin. I'm going to take questions at the end, if that's all right. So a data type has a constructor is wrong in PHP. We don't have constructors. We have initializers. So we have an initializer. It's usually inherited. It's got setters for property values, getters, and so we can start expanding upon a data type class to add some useful methods. So what does that look like? A data type plugin looks like this. And again, it has that annotation block in the comment. And this is like a block. Block plugins have this. Condition plugins have this. All the things have something like this. And the key here is that we have an annotation type, and it says data type. We have an ID. This is sometimes referred just by ID, and sometimes referred as plugin ID. It can be really confusing. Type data is a really, plugin API can be a little confusing in that regard with consistency of terms. And finally, we have, and not all data types have this, but a data type can be defined, have what's called a data definition class. And normal, simple, a primitive data type like a string or a float, these all can inherit from a kind of a base data definition. But when we get into composite data types, or data types that have lots of properties themselves, or hierarchical data types, we need to define our own definition class. So a data definition is a way of describing our what is a part of how, the hierarchical structure of that specific data type with things like constraints or labels or descriptions. So we describe our properties of the data definition, and then we can create data types from that definition. A lot of that is abstracted away into a higher level, like the plugin manager. So you can just say, hey, give me this data type, and it goes, finds the definition, creates the data type for you with any any defaults that you have. So yeah, so as I said, back when I started, definitions were just associative arrays. In fact, there's some still documentation around that where when you create a definition, sometimes you create it as an associative array. So there's a little bit of confusion there. So what does it look like? Your data definition class is, if you're defining a composite data type like this, it's probably going to extend the complex definition base, and you're going to have essentially one main public method, and that's get property definitions, and everything else is inherited from that, either the complex data definition base or the data definition or the list data definition. So what I'm doing here is describing a payment in Xero, and so a payment can have an invoice, which is also a composite data type. And so I can get the definition for an invoice by calling the static create method and giving the type, and then I can chain that and set, say an invoice is required on a payment. I can create simple things like dates, strings, or use floats for the amount. I did not include, not in this one, but you can add constraints. So I could add in Drupal 8, the constraint system is inherited from Symfony 2. So if I had like an allowed values, how we had those allowed values functions or allowed values things in a select list, that's now a choice constraint or an allowed values constraint. If you can go for the simpler choice constraint from Symfony 2 or the Drupal allowed values constraint, which is field only. So you can set constraints and add constraints to your definitions, and then these will be enforced by, if anybody tries to create this data type, that's going to be that constraint is going to be enforced, and it's going to throw validation, it's going to throw validation exceptions. And another cool thing about data definitions is it has built-in support for lists. So there's a concept called list data definition. So if I have a property that's an array or a list, I can define that by calling the list data definition. So I can say, give me a list of, give me, I'm defining line items as a list of line item data types. So pretty useful for, again, I was looking at this, I'm like, this definitely fits the model for Xero. I have a whole bunch of data types that I need to define. I don't want storage. So the type data API gave me a way of doing that. So as an exercise, let's look at Spotify. If I look at the Spotify API and their object model, I have something called an album. And the album consists of a whole bunch of properties. Some are strings like type and name. Others are complex or composite data types themselves, like a list of tracks or a list of artists. So if I was trying to define Spotify, an album, I would, I'd have an album definition, and then it would contain, properties for the name, the type, and the artist, and then I'd have an artist data type with an artist definition class, and that artist definition class would have its own property definitions with, say, a name data definition that defines that says it has a property called name, and it's a string, and it could have a label and a description defined by that public method. Okay, this is pretty deep, right? This is really deep. So I'm kind of starting really low level here. I define all my data types. I define all my definitions for those data types. So why is this actually useful to me? And the answer is for integrating with those third-party services, and Drupal 8 provides, the serializer component from Symfony 2, and it provides Guzzle, and those all integrate very nicely together. So normalization, I can use the type data manager to normalize or denormalize data into data types that are defined in Drupal. And this includes entities or nodes. So the way that the REST API is working, when I get JSON in, and this is like, let's say I'm doing nodes, and I create a view of a REST, I can use that REST export view display in Drupal 8. The way that's going to work is I get JSON in, and that's going to get passed to a deserialize method in the serializer component of Symfony. And what that's going to do is it's going to obviously decode the JSON, and then it's going to get passed to a denormalizer, a normalizer, and that normalizer is then going to translates it's going to get translates that into the proper data representation in Drupal. So if I'm sending this JSON JSON representation of a node, it's going to deserialize, and then finally it's going to get denormalized into a node entity. And so, for Xero, it's going to be the same thing. I just need to write a custom normalizer and denormalizer that will handle my data types in the little quirky ways that I need to do to work with the Xero API. So, you might find you have to do this, write a custom normalizer or denormalizer for whatever API you're working with. The one thing that was really hard to understand about Symfony's serializer component was there was this parameter called context. There was an array. I had no idea what it was. It seemed really confusing. And it's really just kind of a catch-all for all the specific implementations. And so when I want to go ahead to define a normalizer, it's normalizers are a service. They're also a tag service, which means they get a compiler pass in our Symfony dependency injection container. So I need to define that my services YAML file, and I'm going to pass it. I'm going to inject the type data manager, and it gets tagged as normalizer. And essentially, it looks like this. It has a supported interface or class, so I can restrict my normalizer to just Xero types. Because if I tried to do this with nodes, it probably would crash horribly. And then that denormalize method there, it takes this context array, and that context array really, as you can see, it's got this plugin ID key, and that's the specific thing for Drupal that we need in order to, and that's going to exist when that's called. And that's the specific thing we need to instantiate our data types, to go from the raw data into the Drupal data type. So again, what I'm doing here, and this is an abstract implementation, so I can use this normalizer and denormalizer for any of the data types I've defined, is I call the type data manager, has a method called create list data definition, and that takes a plugin ID. And if you remember from the plugin ID, right? So it would take Xero payment. And that gives me, and I say, give me a list data definition, because I don't just want one payment. My API returns me an array of payments or something. So now I have a definition for an array of my data type. And with that, I can then call the create method on type data manager with saying, create a data type that is defined by these properties with this data, and the data is what's serializer, what that deserialized string from Symfony 2. And then I have something like an entity that I can call methods on and getters and to get the value. All right. So putting this all together, let's say I'm looking at my actual implementation. I have a default settings form. So what this does is it's going to basically I kind of have a service that does a lot of this for me. And so I have so I have that context array. I want to get accounts. The Xero query, this query method I'm going to get that in one moment. But the Xero query class just basically does all the guzzle stuff and the serializing stuff for me. I wrote that. And then returns type data. So I have my return type is this accounts variable, which is a data type of, it's a list of accounts. So then I can I can iterate over each account. I have my data types have getters, and I'm using it just like I'm a node. So, nodes are going to kind of works very similar. It has like a type data interface, but it essentially is like I'm looping through nodes or other entities. But this is my own custom data type that has no storage. So just as an example, what Xero query does, it injects the type data manager service, and it has a serializer component, a serializer service. And then using Guzzle, if you're not familiar with Guzzle, you have a Guzzle client. The client makes a request. It's really cool in Guzzle 6. Guzzle 6 supports the PSR7 specification, which is about kind of abstracting HTTP requests in PHP. So you can have like streams, or you can use curl, or so Guzzle 6 is kind of this new fundamental thing, and we have it in Drupal 8. So I have this client calls either get or put or post on an endpoint, giving some defined headers I need for operating with the Xero API. Actually, this is actually Guzzle 3 still. Then it gives me a request, and I send the request, get a response. In Guzzle 6, the difference is they've gotten rid of that send, so you just do this client get and you get a response, which is actually a promise. So we have like PHP promises in the PSR7 spec. It's kind of interesting. And then then I use the serializer component. I have that serializer service, and I call the deserialize method. Passing in the data I got from the response. Could be, in this case, it's going to be XML. I need to pass it what format it is, so XML, and then I pass it that context array. And so this is the use of what I just wrote with the normalizers and the data types. This is, if I was I'm consuming my own code here. And so it looks a lot simpler when I'm consuming it, instead of having to go through all these gigantic associative arrays. Here's another little example. I just wrote this the other week. One of the things I have in Xero API is like a little form helper module. So I came up with a Xero form builder service as my equivalent in Drupal 8, which will basically take a data type, and create a form array for it, a render array for it. Let's see here. There's a lot of code here I have to remember. I just added these to this presentation. So I in this example, I'm trying to provide methods that would be useful. So I was like, hey, get me the element for this this account definition and with this give me the account ID. Because what I wanted to do was provide like an autocomplete path so someone could search for an account name. So there's a lot of code here. I'm not sure if I really want to go through all of it, but I basically want to recursively generate a form array and a form element. So I have this. If you kind of ignore, if you get through that if statement, the first two like else blocks is basically, hey, I'm recursing. And finally, when I get down to a base element that's like a primitive type, then I kind of extract what element type I think I want from that for that primitive, and then I add some additional properties, which I'll show in a moment. So I have this dummy code here which says if the data type is a Boolean, make it a checkbox. If I have the choice constraint, make it a select list. Otherwise, just make it a text field. So that's really naive, but here's my first kind of go at this thing, and it fits my use case in the Xero, in my Xero use case. Additionally, this method here of get additional properties, I have a constraint called Xero GUID constraint, which basically sits on an ID property and make sure that it's actually a GUID. So I say, oh, if it has that property has that constraint, go ahead and make it an autocomplete, because that's kind of my use case. Additionally, that definition, if it is required, set the required attribute. And it's a true. If it's read-only, set the disabled attribute to true. So this is some of the uses. You could probably do this with if you're not defining your own data types. You might do something like this in your own module to make use of type data. Okay, so just a small little break of type data. We have a data type and a data definition. I kind of went over the use of that in the normalizer service and how I'm using it to inject the type data manager into forms, controllers, and services, which abstracts all that away. So I'm just using and creating data types with type data manager. So here's something that's a little scary. Type data in PHP unit, even more scary. There was a session, Drupal 8 or Symfony 2 not so scary. It's a little scary, all these components. But maybe I'm just going too deep. But so type data in PHP unit, unit tests are awesome, right? They're fast, but type data manager is big and scary. It calls itself, it's recursive, so mocking it is not straightforward at all. And I need to mock the service container. Joy! And finally, we have to kind of think about, I want to write PHP unit, I want to write unit tests, I want to start switching to this. So what is actually good for decent code coverage? For instance, if I have a form, what do I actually need to test in a form, in the build form method of my controller? And finally, just recently, as of RC1, trying to use Composer, GitHub, and Drupal on Travis CI is utterly broken. So that's just recent. That's like last week. That was a headache. So PHP unit, I like to see pretty coverage and complexity graphs. If you don't know what that looks like, it looks like this. It's hard to see because of the color, but obviously the one that's 39% is in red, and everything else is kind of in green here. So I'm like, yay, colors! PHP unit gives me coverage distribution graphs and complexity charts, so I can say, yep, I really need to add test to Xero query because that's a pretty bad score. The default settings form has a high complexity, but that's because it's a form. Does it really? Again, the usefulness of PHP unit for testing forms might not be there. I'm kind of trying to go all the way on it, though. Okay, so how do we do that? So if I was going to test a payment definition, or sorry, a definition, a data definition, it has one method usually, right? So if I'm going to get code coverage on this, all I'm doing is, yeah, I got a definition back. And there's a lot of unit tests already in Drupal core that are testing that a data definition does what it does. So how useful is testing this method? I don't know. I mean, it seems like kind of, okay, run through it. Did I get back what I expected? Yeah, it's really easy. But if I need to mock type data manager, I need to do some of the important things. We have this static create method, and it will call itself. It will call type data manager. I need to mock objects. I mean, the mock objects that I mock, they can't simply return one known thing because of that. I have to construct the order or use return value map in PHP unit, which is a helpful method to return multiple values. So you have to carefully construct how your tests are written when you're mocking. And again, a sign of something that needs to be re-architected is complex data, mocking in a unit test. So type data API is like that. So yeah, here's the create instance method in type data. So again, so it calls a whole bunch of things here. It calls a static, and then that will call itself. It's a little, So what I need to do in my PHP unit setup is I need to mock type data manager. I mark that the get definition method is important to mock, and so this is going to return that associative array definition. Remember I said that data definitions sometimes are associative arrays? There's one of them right there. All right? The return value is kind of an array, is that plugin ID from the data type class and the definition class. And here this is a base class that kind of abstracts away a lot of things. And then I needed to do the get default constraints, and I was like, that was way too complex. Just return an array. I don't want to deal with that right now. So I had to then mock the constraint manager service and return a mock of a constraint manager, because type data has a method get validation constraint manager, so I had to mock that. Let's see. And then you have to mock the container. And so you add, you create a new container builder, you set a basic container up. You don't have to mark the entire Drupal container, which is, and then you need, what's nice is that I can actually create that definition pretty easily through that static method. So that's not too bad. So here's an actual test class. I'm creating a whole bunch of data types to assert. And because I've mocked type data manager, that'll work. So get property instance, we need to mock that specifically to return in a specific order the properties that are defined. It's really annoying. I think I might be able to get away with using return value map here, and this is something I wasn't aware of until recently. There's a method called return, instead of this on consecutive calls, you can call this return value map, and that takes an array of return of a parameter and return value in the array. So yeah, and then I can finally do I can call my setters, and then I can say assert equals for that. Okay, so I just showed you a lot of code. I apologize. So I apologize by making a poem. I wrote a poem to apologize about mocking the container. So what I learned not to do, I resign myself to that fate. Besides, core does it too. So please do not hate. This container so small is not actually in my app at all. I do not wish to load or directly invoke the container to get variables into my code, but to be a better maintainer, forgive that what I leverage. All I want is pretty coverage. Another opinion on mocking and type data and unit tests. And I learned the path tool in GIMP, so I drew that. Okay, why go through all of that, right? You're saying it's pretty low-level stuff, right? Well, my previous code was not testable. I had a third-party API, right? How can I test a third-party API on Travis, on a public, it's an open source repository. How can I test that on Drupal.org's infrastructure? I can't, right? I have to have an API key. I can't make that public. So PHP unit allows us, by being able to mock, it allows us to test. I can test my code. So that's why I went through all that. So I can test and have tests, and so I can do regression tests. Type data is, that is not loosely coupled and has strict typing. So again, by defining those constraints, I know that I'm getting the right data out and data back in. I'm constructing the right data type. Before, it was all just a whole bunch of associative arrays. So I was like, oh yeah. So it's a better fit in Drupal 8. So I can integrate with serialization, rules, and probably services module. Yes, there's going to be a services module in Drupal 8. I can do I have some ideas around, creating data types for the various things I might need. Let's say like a learning management system that might need to describe scores and grades or anything else. So I've got about 10 minutes left. So I'll take questions and comments. Have a joined in link for this talk if you wanted to leave feedback there. All right.
So if you have a site where, let's say generically, you're having people use it and they're using it as a service and it defines a customer type for them to use for their customer. And one guy's got a lawnmower shop, the other one's got a poodle shop. Their idea of a customer is different. So you give them a way of selecting what fields they want to make up their customer type. And it seems like you can use the data definition to dynamically be able to generate what the composite customer type is for each of those two people. But my thought is after that, you are not storing.
All right, so there's kind of two questions. The first question, if I get it right, is asking if a data definition can be used to, we can use a data definition to dynamically create things based on kind of different types or differences. And the answer to that is yes, because we can. Yeah, I think you answered that yourself. The second question is about storage. So if I do want to store things, I would think an entity with a bundleable entity might be a better way to go, because you're going to store it in Drupal anyways. I probably would only use map for things that I don't want to store, or I'm passing around between services. Or or I'm using the data definition to then populate something. So that could be another use. You could have, if you had like a real simple API you're consuming, then you could probably translate. You could probably create the nodes via type data, dynamically, and then save the node. So yeah, I think that is possible as well. Yes.
Got a couple of questions floating around. One just came up after that question is there any reason you might want both a data type and an entity, a fielded entity that stores data and a data type that, they're essentially identical with what they represent, or would it just not make sense to?
So The question was, would I ever want to have both a data type representation separate from an actual entity representation? I'd say the answer is no. I mean, it used to be that an entity was type data. It was a data type. And now you have something what's called a type data adopter interface that goes along with entities. So it essentially still is, it kind of is a data type. So the answer is no, because it's kind of already built in. And through that entity adopter interface, or type data adopter interface, or whatever it's called. And next question.
Sure. This might be a silly question, no real way to answer that, I guess. But like, what happens when your service, the third-party endpoint, changes its data representation? Is there any way you can like read? Most of them would have like an endpoint that you can call that defines the data types and everything. Would it make sense to maybe like query that and check for changes or something?
So the question is, would it make sense if you're communicating with a third-party service and they provide an endpoint a schema endpoint essentially, or self-discovery API to then dynamically create data definitions? Sure, I think if you wanted to have a data definition class that did that could be a very interesting thing.
What would break in the when it's all hardcoded? What would break? I mean, anything could break, I guess, if they change it.
Right. Yeah. If your third-party service is changing rapidly and not communicating that to their customers, I think that's a social problem. Okay, but yeah, if I am expecting that name has a constraint on it, or name is a free, it doesn't have a constraint. I can put anything I want in that name property, and then it gets normalized into JSON, and I send it off, and they say, nope, I'm sorry, you have an illegal character in there. Well, I mean, yeah, so it could break. But
one more.
Sure. Does anybody have any other questions first?
Okay, this is just a PHP unit question. I remember that container issue coming up before where, how do you run PHP unit without a service container? Would it make sense, or would it be possible at all, like if you had, some instance of the site, I guess it would have to be running locally, to actually bootstrap Drupal, not a full like simple test site build, but just strap an already existing site just to get the service container from it? Yes,
that is possible. There are two classes actually. CHX said, "Why are there two classes for this?" But there should only be one. There's a test class called kernel test base, I believe, and that is bootstraps an empty service container with a database. So it's kind of not there. I mean, it's kind of. It'll give you a database, so you don't have to mock a lot of things.
And then fill the container with what you need with access to. Okay, so it doesn't actually give you the full fledged.
Right. Otherwise, I think you have to go with the simple test case.
Would you just point it to an instance of the site and ask, give me the service container from?
I'm not trying to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? Poetry, anything? Haiku? Thank you very much for attending. And sitting through all that.